Hello there, everyone, and welcome to today's standards-based grading webinar, what we've achieved and where we're headed. For those who I have yet to meet, my name is Kendall Hunter. I'm the product marketing manager at Otis. I'm a former middle school special education teacher, certified reading specialist, and I'll be your moderator for today. I did implement standards-based grading when I was a middle school teacher, so love this topic, and I'm really excited to dig into it with our panel for today. This webinar is sponsored by Otis. If you haven't heard of Otis, we are a K-12 student data and assessment solution that really helps K-12 schools to track and communicate student progress towards learning standards. Just a couple housekeeping items while you all get settled and logged in today, and then I'll introduce our amazing panelists for this roundtable discussion. Now is a good time to check the technical aspects of our webinar. Please be sure to look at your audio settings on your computer, as well as your speaker volume if you're having any trouble hearing me right now. If you have any issues, there is a detailed audio troubleshooting file in that resource list of the panel for today. If at any point something freezes or you hear music after the presentation has begun, it's begun now, so you shouldn't hear any music. Just refresh your browser and we'll pop right back up on your screen. There are also some other icons that open additional features within the webinar console that I want to point out. The resource list in particular has some great things there for you. You'll see a copy of the slides that are in the portal, as well as some other standards-based grading resources that I've put together for you, including a couple sites and resources on how Otis supports standards-based grading. So definitely give those a look. We encourage you to follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. You can use the hashtag EWWebinar, and don't forget to tag Otis at OtisK12. As we jump into the discussion today, we welcome your questions. This is a roundtable discussion after all. Please type them in the Q&A box that is accessible through the tabs that are on your console and not in the group chat. That'll just help me locate your questions more quickly. We may address some questions live. There is some dedicated time at the end, but we may address some others later by email if we're not able to get to them all. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available within the next 24 hours. So yes, this is being recorded. I know that's always the first question we see, and you'll be able to access that through edweek.org using the same info you used today to log in. So that covers some of our housekeeping issues. Let's talk about the topic, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So during the webinar today, we are going to talk about standards-based grading. If you are new to standards-based grading, it is an approach that really focuses on providing transparency into a student's strengths, as well as their areas of opportunity within a given subject area by really providing or identifying their specific performance on the learning standards that are being covered. So telling them where they are with the skills that you are teaching. And it really all boils down to communicating learning and providing every student a path towards really improving where they're at. And our panel is gonna really share with you today what they've learned on their journey with standards-based grading. It's the end of the school year, you're wrapping things up. It's really the perfect time for reflection. So that's what they're gonna do with us today. So at this point, I'm going to introduce you to the speakers, and then we will jump right into our discussion so that you can start to hear from them and not me about their journey within their districts on standards-based grading. So first up on our panel today, we have Jessica Espinoza. Jessica is a principal at Emerson Public Schools in New Jersey. Jessica has been an educator for 26 years and has spent the last 18 years as an elementary principal. She started her career actually in Texas as a teacher and instructional specialist, and then continued her education journey back to her home state, New Jersey, where she's been for the last 21 years. So lots of experience that we have on this group today. Next up, we have Dr. Susan Ema. Susan is the Director of Teaching and Learning at Marker School District 60, which is in Illinois. Dr. Ema has been an educator for 17 years. She's some of the roles she's held include English learner teacher, Director of Multilingual Programs, Principal, and then now Director of Teaching and Learning. Dr. Ema is passionate about working in diverse communities, as it's where she's been able to learn the most. We have two educators joining us here today together, so you'll see both of them in one window. First up, I have Alicia Acosta, a math teacher at Wilmot Union High School in Wisconsin. Alicia is a high school has been a high school math teacher for 12 years. And next to Alicia, we have Tara Smith, who is an English language arts teacher also from Wilmot Union High School. Tara has been a high school teacher for 5 years and also teaches AP language and composition. We are so fortunate to have the high school perspective here. I saw so many questions come in ahead of time around what does this look like at the high school level? How does this impact college admissions? We're going to get into it all, but we have such a great diverse group of educators, school leaders, and varying backgrounds here to really dig into this conversation. So now that we've met the experts, let's just start chatting SVG. Again, as I mentioned, feel free to share your thoughts as we're going using the group chat, or just say hello and tell us where you're coming from. We're thankful that you're choosing to spend your afternoon with us. I do want to note, as I start prompting the group with some questions here, I did pull these from all of the pre-submitted questions. So I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who sent over a thoughtful question for us. We were able to review those and weave them into our conversation for today. So I am going to start off. We're going to start off by hearing from Dr. Ema. And Dr. Ema, I'm wondering if you can start off by sharing really where your school is at in their journey with standards-based grading, and then what the core goals of standards-based grading are. I do want to note that we had a lot of questions pre-submitted about what exactly it looks like the nitty-gritty, what's the scale, the standards, what grades are doing it. So if you could also touch on the specifics while you share your journey, I think the group would be really excited to just kind of hear where you all are at, or where you are at with your school.
Great. Well, thanks, Kendall. Yeah, we have had quite a journey, actually. We are pre-K through 8th grade school district, and we started the standards-based grade journey in 2014. And I would say we are currently just at K5, and our middle school has great grading system still. So we started and will be there for a little bit in the K through 5 with standards-based grades. Our 6th through 8th does do standards, but they use more of a grade and a points-based system. I would say we had to kind of do a reset after the pandemic. We started it and it kind of got paused, and there was just a lot of, trying to look at standards in a different way. But I also think the pandemic allowed us to really kind of prioritize things, and our state really kind of supported us in prioritizing the standards. So when we came out of the pandemic is when we really started digging deeper into our standards-based grading practices, really amplifying our PLC plus structure that we have in order for us to do this work, and really looking at a platform that was going to allow us to look at our curriculum, which is priority standards, success criteria, and learning intentions, and measure that and use it to guide our instructional practices. So I would say our journey in the last few years have been really intense around getting some of those structures up and running for our students. One thing I would say is we really have a belief system around what the purpose of standards-based grades are and our curriculum, and it really is about student learning and growth. So everything that we are doing is trying to see where kids are at and supporting them where they're at in that journey, but also helping them achieve grade level standards or beyond with the feedback that we're giving, with them giving us feedback in their learning, and supporting that journey along the way. I don't know if you want me to go into our rating scale. We have a 3-scale rating system, which starts at emerging, approaching, and proficient, and we've used that quite a bit in developing assessments commonly around it to kind of assess where kids' learning is at.
That's super helpful. Thank you for adding that context there around the scale. Folks are always interested what it looks like and what the language is. I also just want to call out that you said your PLC structure supports this work. I'm sure we'll hear that from others, but just knowing what goes into identifying those standards, aligning, having those calibration conversations, like the time in PLC was so critical to that. So I love to hear you point that out, because I don't know how this work would be possible without time as teams to just really dig into this. Jessica, what about over at Emerson? What has your journey with standards-based grading been like so far? And what are some of the goals as to why you all have chosen to implement this?
So our journey really began about 9 years ago in grades K through 5, and We, at that time, looked deeply at all of our standards, and we basically put into our report card all of the language arts and math standards at that time. And we condensed some of the other content areas, but that was what we really focused on. About 5 years ago, we began working with the Great Schools Partnership out of New England, and we really started to dig more deeply into our standards, looking at the New Jersey Student Learning Standards and our proficiency work through PLGs, our professional learning groups, to look at the best practices. And we really started to refine our work across a pre-K to 12 curriculum and our graduation proficiencies. And we started to align those not just with standards, but with a scoring criteria. Today, in our 4th and 5th grade, we're currently piloting a new report card, which looks at much fewer proficiencies overall. We combine that with the actual scoring criteria, and we're really looking at word descriptors on a 4-point scale, beginning with preparing and then developing, proficient, and excelling. So it's really been a gradual process and a journey, but it came from really trying to report on every single standard and kind of really narrowing that down into reporting out on much fewer standards.
Thank you for summing some of that up. I also want to call out 9 years. There's so many folks who have on, who we see questions from that's like, we're just getting started. Where do we begin? Just a reminder to everyone, no matter where you are, it is a journey, right? You've made changes every year. It's never too late to reset the table. Something's not working. 9 years, that's a very long time to be on this journey. And it sounds like a wealth of experience along the way. I also love that you called down narrowing down your standards or proficiencies. We have seen schools, generating report cards with like 50 standards. And it's like, that is so many standards for the teachers to track, prioritize, narrow down, look at the main bucket that they fall, a particular set of standards falls into. I think that is just such a big piece of tackling how teachers can manage this, right? Because even as a student, if I have a list of 50 things and I have a 4-point scale for each and I'm, maybe I'm at a 2 on a lot of them, how do I even prioritize what I need to focus on when there's that many? So that's great tips there. I want to toss it to our high school teachers, Alicia and Tara. Tell us about your standards-based grading journey at Wilma and where you all are at now.
We started our standards-based journey in 2017. We started within our PLCs, picking essential standards, unpacking the essential standards, book studies, picking essential standards again, unpacking again. And it was just a lot of figuring out what our standards are and being owners of those standards and taking ownership and knowing what we wanted to be teaching and what students needed to know. It took a long time, but within our PLCs, we felt like we understood what was expected of students, and then we finally ripped the Band-Aid off this year, and our whole entire school is doing standards-based grading at the high school level. We did decide last year to have 25 pilot teachers. We were using a Skyward platform back then, and so we were kind of working through the kinks that offered and figured out that there were a lot more cons than pros. So this year, when we did transition our entire school of about 65 teachers, grades 9 through 12, we did end up changing platforms because, like some of the other presenters had said, the goal was really to articulate the level of understanding per standard. And we thought that we needed a better technology to be able to communicate that and be able to then also communicate from teacher to teacher about where the students were at in that process. So we went through a lot of revising, and it seemed like we were in this book study and revision cycle for years until we were finally like, we just need to do it and figure out where we were strong at, where we had some tweaks to make, and how we could kind of move forward from there.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. And I did see a couple questions come in the Q&A, and I want to just open it up to the group on this because I think there are definitely some misconceptions here around. And this question came from Constantine. What would you say to the administrator who thinks that by prioritizing standards, the others will not be taught? So actually, Alicia and Tara, I'm wondering if you can tell me, since you all said kind of, we picked the standards, we picked the standards again, we went through this process. By prioritizing, are you not teaching things, or are you just reporting out on specific standards?
That is a very good question. So we are definitely teaching more than we are assessing. So when we first started our process, we broke down our standards based on what was nice to know and what we wanted our students that they needed to know. So from there, we broke down the needs to know as this is what will be required for every student to be summatively assessed on. And the nice to knows were kind of the stuff that we did within the class. If there were certain kids that were not showing proficiency yet, we could use it as an extension for the other students. So we did still teach quite a bit of material that is not summatively assessed in our grade book, but I think it was the breakdown within our PLCs to be able to determine those nice to knows and the need to knows. And that kind of helped filter out which ones went in the grade book and which ones didn't.
That was brilliant.
The need to knows are skills that we thought kids needed throughout all classes in high school. So for English, our writing skills, you write in every class. So we tried to pick skills that if they did not get it in English class, it would not be good for them in other classes. So it was a skill that required a lot of endurance. So we're like, if kids don't have this skill, they are not going to be successful in high school or out of high school. So they need to know it. Whereas some other skills would be like, yeah, it would be great if you knew this and could do this. But if you don't know it, you will not be at a disadvantage in all of your other classes or after you graduate high school. So it'd still be nice if you knew it. So maybe that could be an extension for kids that already showed proficiency or they were advanced on the skill, but it was not absolutely required to be a well-rounded student.
That's great input. And I think that's such a good tangible takeaway. If you're here with us today and you're like, I want to bring something small back to my PLCs, narrowing down the standards, think about that nice to know versus need to know. I thought that was just such a simple way to kind of prioritize. Susan, I saw some head nodding there. Anything similar to what you all are doing with your work on prioritizing standards?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Alicia and Tara said. The same conversation we had in our district, just a nice to know, need to know, and really just those essential skills or standards that are going to go across grade levels, like, getting deeper and deeper in order for them to be readers or mathematicians or scientists. These are things that we really kind of need to hone in and focus in on a majority of the time. Now, all the other it's not that we're not teaching to those. We still need to use them supporting in different ways, but it allowed us to prioritize to say, okay, we really want to assess quite frequently and give some feedback to the students on around these need to know skills in order for them to be readers and writers and mathematicians and things like that. So I agree with where they were at with really good conversations with teachers, and as a curriculum program director, really ensuring that we give time and space for teachers to not only have conversations at the grade level, but across the grade level or across departments to really talk about that and to prioritize together.
That's so key, that communication outside of just your team. Thank you for sharing that. Kind of segueing here to a little bit of a reflection on your current grading practices. I'm going to toss it to Jessica first. Jessica, I'm wondering if you can share if there was any research that you all used to develop some of your grading guiding principles. For example, we had a lot of questions come in around like, are you using Marzano? Did you create a homegrown standards-based grading model? And then just kind of with that context in mind, what are you doing that's working well and fit that goal for how you envisioned standards-based grading, as well as what might be some areas of opportunity? Unmute. Go.
So as I mentioned a bit earlier, we really did some work and we're still working with the Great Schools Partnership. And they have 1 million free resources available on their website, but we have been consulting with them directly. So they are an amazing resource that has provided us so many tools, input. They've really grounded our support. You spoke to, Kendall, about the idea of bringing your teachers together, not just individually, but of course, grade bands and grade levels. Our teachers were coming together, working in summer institutes for 3 days at a time, really looking at the standards and saying like, what works here, what doesn't, across multiple grade bands. and across content areas. And without that time, I don't think we could be where we are today. In speaking to the actual challenges, there are many. And, you mentioned about our 9-year growth here. We've definitely had challenges. We still have challenges. I think one of the biggest challenges we face today is really having parents truly understand standards-based grading and how that translates into their student understanding of skills. As much as we've tried to reiterate that and explain it and have parent nights, it's still something that's difficult to bring across to the parent community. So that is definitely a challenge that we faced. I also think that a challenge we faced is finding the time for teachers to have those conversations. But we've had a wonderful curriculum director and district in which we've been able to carve out that time, pay teachers for their summer work and those types of things. But the Great Schools Partnership, their resources are free and they've really been tremendous in helping us move the needle in standards-based grading.
That's very helpful. I hadn't heard of that resource. So if anyone is interested, it's the Great Schools Partnership, and those, it sounds like, free resources for standards-based grading. So thank you so much for sharing that. Alicia and Tara, I'm going to toss it to you. And we did have a lot of questions coming in around your book study. So I'm wondering if when you're sharing more about some of your guiding principles, you could just maybe touch on what books you all had been reading. I'm guessing those shaped a little bit of what you all are doing now. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of starting us off with some of your current grading policies or practices and how you're doing meeting those right now.
So we are 100% summative assessments. Those are the only assessments that directly impact a student's grade that gets reported on their transcript. We do still track their formative assessments, but the formative assessments do not have an impact on the transcript grade in a formal way. Obviously, we all know that if you don't do the formatives, it will impact your success on the summative, but the formative grade does not impact your overall grade. And then we do convert the standards-based grading grade eventually into a letter grade, and that gets reported to colleges on transcripts and helps with GPA calculation and all of that. So 100% summatives, formatives do not impact the grade.
It's been our way of kind of trying to ease kind of the blow to the society about, like, we're making this transition to standards-based and they're used to the traditional. They want to know their GPA, scholarships, colleges, all of that. So being able to still articulate what the standards-based grade means to more of a traditional sense has been a pretty tough, but I think now at the end of the year, it's become more understood about how it is converted from one to the other. We do use a 4-point scale. In all of our conversations, though, we do not use the number value. We use our words. So 4 is advanced, 3 is proficient, 2 is emerging, and 1 is beginning. So we've really had to train our students to stop talking about the number. At the high school, the kids chase their grades. What I need to get a blah, blah, blah. So we're really trying to be like, well, have you shown proficiency? Where are you at in your level of understanding? So it's taken months of training, but we're slowly starting to train them, train ourselves, and train their parents to kind of change the way you look at the grade as far as understanding and not just a number that's going to calculate to a GPA.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that you all are kind of training yourself, even though it's a 1 through 4 scale, to move to the actual language of that. Because I imagine that kind of helps to facilitate that shift or that transfer of thinking. And the reality is, I know when I was in school, we had letter grades, I had an 89%. You know, what was that? The difference between an 89% and a 90%, an A and a B, right? Like a big deal to a lot of many students. So kind of moving that shift to like, you're advanced or you're this, I imagine that's just really powerful. And we did have a ton of questions coming in around how you all were actually calculating GPA or letter grades for transcripts. So thank you for sharing that. Do you by chance remember the name of the book that you all read? You mentioned a book study, and we had some people asking. If not, no worries. Any shout outs to the literature you all read?
There were so many books, and as an English teacher, I feel like I am a bad representation because I don't remember. I can picture the cover. It was colorful. It was white.
Don't even worry.
it was years of reading books, and there were so many, and I can't.
When we find a book on our bookshelves, we can send it, and then you can send it out to all of the attendees because it's on our bookshelves. I can't picture it either.
We'll put it in the follow-up email as a reference. No worries at all there. Dr. Ema, I'd love to toss it to you. Just kind of thinking about what resources or what really guided your principles for standards-based grading, and then where are you all at now in terms of meeting them or areas of opportunity?
You know, I think there are a lot of great researchers out there on this topic. So, you know, Marzano, I think a little bit of our work has been guided by Larry Ainsworth and priority standards, power standards. But I also think a big piece that we've had a lot of conversations around, whether it's standards-based grading, our professional learning system for our teachers, which is the Danielson cluster, it's around Hattie's work. And what types of things that we are doing as teachers that make the greatest impact. And teacher clarity is something that we really talk about. And not only knowing what those standards are and what they mean, the steps and the skills that are needed for it, but students have that understanding as well. So that really has been a guiding practice for us in our PLCs to really dig deeper into the standards and to really kind of have an understanding as a whole about, you know, in this unit, this is the standard that we are really looking at, and here's the steps that we need to take to get there. And this is how it's going to be communicated with our students. And then obviously our standards-based grades, you know, we have looked at a platform. We've definitely been implementing Otis now for about a year, and with K through 5. And that has been a wonderful platform for us to kind of drive everyday instructional practices for our teachers. Because our other system prior to that was mainly just a report card system. We were reporting out in trimesters, and then the teachers had many different ways of trying to collect the data in various ways. And this allowed us to really put it into one system, have some really great conversations around the standards, and then be able to kind of pull reports quickly to make some instructional decisions. So it's just been, we've got so much more to grow and learn in, but I feel like that platform to really kind of help us make in the now instructional decisions around our standards has helped us kind of move even farther.
Well, thank you for putting the shout out in for Otis. If anyone hasn't heard of Otis, we do support schools with standards-based grading. And I would agree that like real-time picture of here's the standard, here's where we're at with it is the power that you need to make the decisions to actually go back to the classroom, you know, decide we can move past this content. We need to reteach this content, kind of divvying up student needs, class needs, and all that. Dr. Ema, we did have a question, and while you're talking about your grading policies, I want to circle back to it. This is from Sherry. Thank you, Sherry, for this question. Sherry was just curious, why did you all choose a three-point scale versus a 4-point scale? Did you experiment with both? Any trial and error? Was it a team decision? And anything you can share. There were a couple wonderings on what your experiences is with 3 versus 4, if you have anything to share.
Yeah, you know, I think anything that we do, really bringing in the teacher voices within your system, as well as, you know, what kind of research and best practice is happening around there, and kind of wrestling with it a little bit. We wrestled with the 4 versus the 3. And our team really decided to go with 3 because we just started finding that it was either going to tip it to one scale. So like proficient, we got rid of our exceeding. And it's just you either have your grade level standards, you're getting close to those grade level standards, or you're at the beginning stages. And we always like to put the yet on the end for the growth mindset because we believe every kid can get there. It's just we have to kind of meet them where they're at and support them along the way. So I would say, you know, I don't necessarily think there is necessarily one way, but it's really bringing the teacher voices in, having some conversation around research, and then making a decision where your staff and your community understand what those 3-level or 4-level really means in regards to student learning.
Makes perfect sense. It's really about finding a system that works for your system too, right? The technology shouldn't be the initiative or the focus. You need to be able to do what resonates and what works for your teachers, and the rest will kind of follow. Jessica, I'm gonna toss it to you next, but we're gonna segue a bit here to talking about assessment. We received a lot of questions on formative versus summative assessment. I know we heard from Alicia and Tara that summative for them is 100%. Jessica, what's going on with your school population for assessments? How do you ensure alignment between the assessments and standards? What work have you all done over the last 9 years to kind of get to a place where you can have varying data points on a student's journey towards mastery?
Thanks. So I feel as though this year has been our biggest year in terms of really discussing assessment deeply in terms of getting everyone on the same page and within a grade level. Formative assessment plays an integral role, especially in the elementary grades. It's just a part of everything they do. The teachers are constantly assessing students through exit tickets, classwork, conversations, just sitting alongside of a student and listening into what they're doing. So those formative assessment pieces are so important. Some of the major conversations we've had this year with our piloted report card in 4th and 5th grade is figuring out what assessments should be included in this new report card, and really discussing that within a grade level, within a content area, and just really beginning to assessment map. So looking now, we have these proficiencies, we have the scoring criteria, but now what is our assessment map looking like? So where do we go to our assessments and say, okay, this is actually something that we're assessing that's going to be reported out to parents and appear on a child's report card. So our teachers are having those heavy conversations right now, because if a teacher is assessing a child 25 times across one standard and another teacher is assessing only 5 times across that standard at a 4th grade level, there seems to be some inequities there. So that has been some really important and critical conversations that really just came up for us this year as we got more into the weeds with standards-based grading. So I'm proud of it, but again, it's difficult, and these are real challenging conversations that we're having to have.
Absolutely, and I think that transparency, as an administrator, is just key. Kind of being able to say, hey, we're seeing this here. What are they doing that's working? We're seeing this over here. What opportunities can we use to bridge the gap? That transparency and being able to have access to that. I believe you all are using Otis, correct, for standards-based grading?
Okay. Yes, yep. And so again, we decided to go with a new report card for 4th and 5th grade this year as a pilot, and then in January, we decided to go with Otis in terms of taking all of these slips of paper and charts and graphs and actually putting them into a digital system with Otis. And I think that is where we started to see, okay, we have all of this, we have everyone's pieces of paper now in a digital system, and we're really starting to see, hey, this person's only has 5 assessments on this standard and this person has 20. There really does seem to be this inequity. And so that's been a beautiful highlight, but also something that has allowed our teachers to really talk about where do we go with this conversation. And it's also driven the idea that how important this assessment mapping truly is. So again, as an administrator, it's not me saying that the assessment map is important. It's the data saying it, which I think any administrator on the call could agree. When the data says it, it's a bit more powerful.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Imam, how does assessment look with your students and your teachers?
Yeah, again, I'm going to go back to our PLC, the strength of our PLCs and the time. To really kind of think through those questions. You know, the first question is, where are we going? So you're looking at your standards and really understanding what the standards are. And then how are you assessing those standards? You know, where are we at now? And I would say we really are leaning into our platform, which is Otis, around putting those assessments in this platform and really kind of tagging as they create an assessment. And there's lots of opportunities to create different assessments, whether it's, you know, a test, a project, a presentation, using a rubric. They can put it all in there, and then they tie it to a priority standard, or possibly what we call a learning intention, which is like kind of sub skills underneath. And then once the kids, all the data is in there, then as a team, they're looking at that data together to really say, hey, looks like our kids are doing really well in this standard, this priority standard, this sub skill, and we need to work here, or we need to do a small group here. So we're using, specifically in math, we do quite a few formative assessments just to see where kids are at. And then as they get to the end, there's a summative there as well. Now, our families can get in. This is so different from our previous platform where it was just at the report card timeframe. We are trying to really build this capacity that all of our families can get in and see their kids, how they're doing towards those standards at any point in time. We have a ways to go with really kind of engaging our families around that, but hopefully by the time report cards come around, because we use Otis to share out the report card, that eventually it won't really necessarily need to be a big time frame for families, because they're in on a regular basis, kind of understanding where their kids are at. So that's kind of how we've been using it. But I would say, again, going back to the strength of your PLC and those conversations that teachers are having, and then having a platform to be able to get that data quickly, to be able to analyze it as a team. I mean, collective efficacy is huge, and we can't do this work in silos.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Collective efficacy is so key in education. We all have to be together. We can make the biggest impact. I love that. I did put on the slide deck, I just moved to some images of Otis. If you are curious about some of the tools Jessica and Dr. Ema were talking about in terms of those like rubrics to track students. I know I heard Jessica say, you can use a rubric while you're observing a student. Maybe before this was done on a piece of paper and then it lives in a stack on your desk. But when you start to track everything in one place, you get those visuals like in that middle screen that you might see in the deck right now, where you can kind of follow a student's learning journey and then scale up to see your whole class and where everyone's at in their journey. So those are just some really powerful tools to keep in mind as we continue the discussion here. But I want to toss it to our high school teachers here for their perspective. I know we heard that you are 100% summative assessment. So I do want to dig into this. We had a lot of questions come in on this. I'm mostly curious, what do the students think about the 100% summative assessment? Like, you're in high school, I'm sure we've got lots of opinions going around. How have your students received that, just knowing that kind of that last touch point is going to count? Has it been well received, a challenge? What have you all seen with that in your assessment practices?
I think a challenge puts it lightly. Yeah. We came from where formatives were 20% and summatives were 80%, and we had changed it to 25 and 15, and we've done all the things. We had a final exam that had weight, and we had all of the traditional things everyone has tried. So making the transition to 100% summative really just took the students to understand the reason behind it, and sitting down and having those conversations with them and explaining, like, the formative is where you're supposed to get the feedback. It's the learning process. It's supposed to be messy. This is why you're here, to make these mistakes, to learn from them and to grow from them. You shouldn't be penalized for the learning process, because otherwise you'd be in the class above where you're currently at. So really, but then explaining to the kids, like, you may need 5 practice problems, you may need 1, you may need 15. We all have different needs depending on the topic, and being able to say, not everyone needs to sit down and do these 30 math problems right now, and I'm going to grade them all tomorrow. Because for some people, that's not a good use of their time. So being able to also explain to those students that we understand everyone has different needs. And so I'll have students that will just come to me and be like, I know on this test, I don't understand this standard very well. Can I have 4 practice problems on this standard? And we've really honed in the conversations on what they need. And some kids are like, I'm getting more comfortable with this. Can you push me further? And I want to try for advanced now. And I think it's really changed the conversation around where they feel they're at with the level of understanding. And again, not so much chasing points of, well, I brought you a box of tissue. Can I have 5 extra credit points? Which we all know has nothing to do with the grade in the class, but everyone gave it at one point in their teaching career. So it was definitely a struggle. It is still a struggle, but I think when you stick to the reason of why the formative shouldn't penalize the student, it does help them kind of meet you where you're at with that.
Yeah, and I've noticed with teaching AP, some of our high achieving students, they are scared to be anything but perfect. And when formatives count, they would be scared to do it because they were concerned that if they didn't do well the very first time they were trying something, that would penalize them in the long run. So sometimes we would see in the past kids would cheat on their formatives, and then when it was time for the summative, they would not do as well as what they did on the formative, and we'd have to get to the bottom of that. So I'm at least noticing kids are willing to try and they're willing to fail, which is an important part in the learning process. And then it's kind of like a choose your own adventure educational experience after that, because they will be able to say, I did not do well on this specific skill. I need support on this, rather than, well, I cheated on the homework and then I bombed the test. I don't know what went wrong. And I think part of the struggle was kids were saying, well, if I'm not getting a grade for it, I'm not going to do it. So at the beginning of the school year, we had a lot of emails and frustration and concerned students that they weren't feeling like they were learning or the class was too hard. And one thing that I did in AP is I made sure that the formatives were very relevant to the summatives. We all use backward design. We figure out where we want them to be and then make sure that the formatives are the little stepping stones to get to that. And I determined that my ultimate summative is the AP exam. So then I had the actual summatives in class that I grade, and then the formatives had to make sure that they supported the AP exam. So once the kids realized that it was relevant practice and that it mattered, and that if they tried, got the feedback, made corrections, then they did better on the summative. They didn't recognize it right away. I'd say early November is when I started noticing a bigger buy-in with it. So it is a learning process, and change is scary. I think it's human nature to kind of resist change sometimes, but if you just stick with it and keep the expectations there and support them as they're learning how to do school in a standards-based grading system, it will be worth it in the end.
Those are great additions to our conversation just around, I love to hear that consistency piece, right? It's like with anything in education, behavior management, creating a positive classroom culture. Like, you just have to keep at it. You keep reiterating your why, and students will eventually start to see the value in it. But I think so many on the call will probably be able to connect to that beginning of the school year. You know, your syllabus goes out or your notes go out around what you're doing, and everyone's throwing their papers in the air like, we're not going to learn. What is this going to do? And then it's just that consistency of saying, like, hey, we chose this for a reason. We believe in this. We're going to stick to this. We're going to do this. And then as we're all having this conversation, you know, we've heard you say, like, there's been challenges, right? So you reset the table, you look at what you're going to do for the next year. There's areas of opportunity, you find them, you talk about them in your PLCs. As Dr. Ema has been mentioning, those are so powerful to their teams. And, you know, everything is up to help our students grow. So it's all in their best interest. That was super informative, though, so thank you. I do have one other question about formatives, and we've seen this one come in quite a bit, and it's a reality, right? So I just want to make sure we acknowledge it. It's around teacher workload, right? If we have a lot of formative assessments, how in the world do educators balance multiple assessments, that reassessment process, then the feedback loop, and the time that it takes to give students feedback so that they can use that to improve their learning? Jessica, what have you all seen with those multiple assessment opportunities and feedback loops? Are teachers able to manage the workload effectively? Is this a topic of conversation? What are you seeing with your teachers?
So I wish my teachers were here. It's a constant topic of conversation, and I think that teachers are constantly struggling with the workload when it comes to standards-based grading, but also when it comes to traditional grading. I don't think I believe my teachers know my students better than they have ever before. When you know your students from a standards-based level, you know them very deeply, you know how well they understand a topic. Tara, I loved hearing you say that your students know how to understand standards and understand school well. And it's just a different way of understanding school. So going back to your formative assessment question, it is hard work. And the ways around it for our teachers have really come back to Otis. And it's come back to this idea of like taking all of this data and taking all of these things that I have and being able to put them into an easier system, a system where I can keep track of everything. And I'm not going to say that means less work necessarily, but it just means that it's been more systematic for them. So it's still hard work, and we're still refining and figuring out ways to figure out streamlining all of that. But having a system to be able to put it into has definitely helped to support our teachers and doing that hard work and making it meaningful. Because again, they know their students better than they ever have.
Love hearing that. It's so important that we're able to have those conversations. And if students can articulate their strengths and areas of opportunity, that is just a step in the right direction, and no doubt. Yeah, right. You're like, oh, that's a aha moment we wait for. Alicia and Tara, from the teacher perspective, we know Jessica said she wished her teachers were here. What kind of conversations are you all having, especially just thinking back to my own high school experience, essays? Tara, I know you're grading those. My math assessments were quite lengthy. How are you handling that, like reassessment, formative feedback process? And you know, how's the workload for your team in terms of all the students that you have and all the products you have to assess?
I would say creating the assessments, the workload is a little bit more, it's a little bit more than what it was previously, because you have to make sure everything aligns to skills and not just, hey, here's a cool question I want my kids to explore. So you have to make sure that it's purposeful, and that does take a little bit more time. But I personally like it for grading, because if a student turns in a 5-paragraph essay and I'm assessing maybe 3 skills, I know exactly what I'm looking for, and I'm not kind of getting stuck in the other things that they're doing or showing me, and I'm not getting distracted. I know exactly what I'm looking for, and if I see it, great. If I don't, then they did not provide me evidence of that skill. I've also realized that they don't always have to write me a full-length essay. You can do a short paragraph writing sample, which decreases my workload, but you can still maintain rigor, and that needs to be a really well thought out paragraph. Also, feedback does not have to be written. It can be verbal. So sometimes I will have students stop and write their response to something. I will walk down the aisles with my clipboard. I know my rubrics, so I don't need my rubric right in front of me. I can spot check it. I can talk with it, talk to the student about it, mark down their score. I'm giving them the verbal feedback. They make the corrections themselves. I move on to the next student. So that decreases the workload a little bit, but also knowing exactly what you are looking for so that you are not kind of guessing what to assess them on and what score to give them, or this feels like a 95%, you know exactly what you're looking for. So that cuts down.
And I think it goes back to your PLCs. We spent hours and hours, days with our PLCs making clear, well-tailored rubrics. Our rubrics are tailored to each standard, to each assessment. So as the standard level is increasing, like in math, it gets harder as you go, the rubric is then changing. So you have your rubric next to you, you have the students work in front of you. It's not -1 point, -1/4 point, -2.5 points. It doesn't look like that anymore. It's looking at the feedback of what did they understand, what didn't they understand, and then looking at the rubric and just looking at it at a whole piece of, on this standard, can they do it? Instead of minusing all of these points from the traditional 100 points and really just putting them into just one bucket, they're able to see where they're coming from. So I'd say the workload on the front end of making a good rubric in your PLC takes a lot more time than it used to. We had to get rid of a lot of those fluff questions, the extra stuff you don't really need anymore. So we're tweaking things constantly. But then once it goes to sit down and grade it, I do believe it's going faster. So I do think I like that part of it, that I can go much quicker with one student's piece of work, whereas before it was a little bit more time consuming.
Thank you both for sharing that. We are actually nearing the last 10 minutes of our webinar here. Whew, time flies when you're having a good conversation with great school leaders. So thank you, all of you, for sharing your anecdotes and just all the information you've shared thus far. We've had a ton of questions come in, so our audience is extra engaged, and we appreciate that. So I want to just transition to a couple of those questions before we wrap up today. And Dr. Imai, I'm going to start with you. I know we didn't get to hear from you on that last one, but I think this one will resonate. We've had a couple questions on consistency across classes, instructors, and even departments. One educator shared that in their district, they use a 1 through 4 standards-based grading scale, but the biggest struggle has been aligning. For example, one teacher gives a 4 when it's perfect. Another teacher gives a 4 when that means the student can teach the content to somebody else. Dr. Ima, have you had any conversations like this? Has there been anything similar in your district that you've had to overcome, or any advice on where to start for this school leader who's seeing this across teams?
Yeah, I think this question response is very similar to what you just heard by my other panelists. I'm going to really lean into our PLCs again are the foundation of how we structure and function our work. And so when we're talking about this 3 scale in our district or 4 scale in your district, it's building assessments together in your PLC and having a clear understanding around, here's the standard we're focusing on today, and this is what we're going to be assessing. And I think Tara might have said this, but it's almost like having a laser-like focus on what is it that I'm expecting kids to be able to do and learn today. And that's the only thing I'm going to be focusing in on, because there's a ton of other things that are happening and there's a lot of learning that's happening, but I need to get a good read on that. And the PLC, it's that conversation as a group. One of the things that I found as we implemented our new platform, Otis, and building these assessments with rubrics, is I had a teacher say, oh my goodness, I thought it meant this. This is how I would have graded it without this conversation. I would have done a 3, and the other one's like, I would have done a 2. But when they had common language around what a 3 is towards that standard and a 2 and a 1, it was a heavy lift in the beginning. It slowed us down a bit. But then once they got doing it, it was like the data was clean. They were all feeling like, ooh, we have a common understanding, and then we can work together in how we support our students across the grade level. Do we need to do small groups? Do we need to do a large group activity? The data just became more rich with that conversation. So that is what I would say, is building those rubrics together, having the space and time, and don't be afraid. It's going to slow down the process a bit, but it will get a little quicker once it's all worked out.
Thank you for elaborating on that. I'm going to toss this next question to Jessica because we haven't heard from you in a moment here. We are getting a lot of questions around supporting, or really what those conversations in PLCs look like to support students with diverse needs. I'm thinking like special education students, English language learners. Have your PLCs begun to really dissect like how and what groups of students need, or what do those conversations look like at the student level as far as like what instructional strategies might benefit? Have we moved beyond just analyzing the data to planning instructional activities that are relevant? Can you share more how your PLCs are engaging in discussions around that?
Sure, I will try my best. So we have a PLG that's focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we have a PLG that's focused on instruction and assessment. And our staff is relatively small, so we often come together upon those 2 topics. Much of our work when we went to the Great Schools Partnership was really upon the idea of building more equity into our grading practices. So even though we began standards-based grading approximately 9 years ago, the work at that time wasn't about building equity into our grading. And so really our work starting about 5 years ago was really more focused on how do we become more equitable for our students, whether that be for special education needs, whether that be for ELL learners, whether that just be for students that come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So that was really the goal in really refining our practices. And I feel that Tara and Alicia really spoke to this. Like, it's not about bringing in the box of tissues and getting your extra credit points or being a student that's good at, doing school well. It's really more about, are you getting at those proficiencies? And one thing that really spoke to us and really helps our teachers is that we grade on habits of work. And that's something that's really separate from the actual standards. And That has helped our teachers to acknowledge the students' grit, their perseverance. Are they working well collaboratively with each other? So that's still acknowledged for students, but it's completely separate from whether or not they are able to add, subtract, multiply fractions, read on grade level. So those things are completely separate from whether or not a student gets along well with a peer or can turn their homework in on time. So I think separating those two things has really allowed us to hit at the diversity and the equitableness of our grading practices.
I think that's huge. And you actually touched on something that I'd seen coming in through the Q&A and chat throughout is that motivation and engagement piece, right? Because the first thing or the first pushback to standards-based grading is often, why would I care, right? I don't have to worry about getting an A anymore. This is just gonna, my students' motivation is gonna be gone. Their engagement isn't gonna be there. They're not gonna care if they don't have to work towards an A, or if the 4.0 group doesn't get their pizza lunch at the end of the quarter. It's, people are gonna be very upset. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Student skills is an excellent way to really separate behavior from academics and help a student to see, here's where you are academically, but here's where you need to improve, maybe with your peer cooperation or your work completion or digital citizenship, whatever it may be, because then we really have a picture of the whole child and who they are. I do want to ask one last question around student engagement to our other panelists who didn't get to touch on that yet, or we have throughout, but just to elaborate a little bit more as we wrap things up here, thinking about how all of this boils down to our students and what's best for them. Alicia and Tara, I'm going to have you both start us off, but do you think that student understanding and engagement has been impacted in your district? And if so, in what ways in response to these shifts?
I would definitely say we've seen a more positive impact. I teach a couple of honors courses too, and having the students just continuously pushing themselves. You have these kids that before were always chasing an A, and now you've taken that A away from them, but now it's just keep pushing them. Those kids want to do better. They want to see the furthest they can go. So whenever I just look at them and be like, oh, but what if I change this in the problem? What would it do? And I just kind of walk away and they look at me and they're like, oh, I don't know. So then all of a sudden you can see the wheels start turning, and all it takes is just a little question and just kind of push them. Even with some of my lower performing students, if they just get stuck in the middle, I always have a flare pen in my hand. I just kind of walk around, and in my handwriting, I just kind of give them one little nugget of help, and then I walk away, and then they all of a sudden can keep going. So just kind of keeping the conversation on, again, I know I've said it like 5 times, but the level of understanding of where they're at, they want to do well. They want us to be proud of them. They want us to be happy. They want them to feel happy. They want to be confident. So being able to keep that conversation focused, I think the engagement piece then just comes right along with it. It's not about filling out a crossword puzzle right now because we've got 10 minutes left of class. It's about, hey, I just thought of this really weird question. Do you guys think you could solve it for me? I'm just going to make it up real quick. And then they're like, oh, is it possible? Yeah. And then they just play with it. So I think giving purpose to it kind of helps keep them moving.
Yeah, definitely. And we've noticed that when we remove the behaviors from the grading, some students were really good at turning everything on time and not being penalized for that. They were really good at getting the crossword puzzles done and raising their grade. We had some nice grade raising assignments in the past that would maybe make a student a B+ A student. Now that it's just skill based, we're seeing some of those grades kind of pull back a little bit. And that actually motivates students because they're like, I've always been an A student. Yes, you were an A student because you had a really great completion grade. And now they're like, well, I need to analyze better. I need to be able to do this one skill better, and then I will be an A student. So I'm seeing a lot more ownership of the actual learning, and that drives the motivation.
And it took time. It took time. This did not happen, I would say, probably for me until about Christmas break, when we were like, they're finally like, oh, and it took a lot of time and a lot of pushing and consistency to get them to where they're at now.
Mm-hmm. And now I think they're more proud of their grades because they know that they did it and they know that they know it, rather than just like, oh yeah, I got an A on that. They're like, I am advanced in this skill. Guess who's advanced? It's me. So I see motivation as a lot better.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing some of what you have seen from your students, because that really is most important. Dr. Ema, I just want to go to you for any last additions you want to share around student understanding or engagement, any shifts you've seen as a result, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Yeah, I think the more our teachers know and understand about the standards and the skills that are needed to get them there, I think it allows more opportunities for autonomy in the classroom and student voice and student choice and how to get there. You know, for example, going into our kindergarten classrooms and in math, kids being able to know, like, you know, I can count to 10 and I'm going to show you how I know this. And then they're showing in different ways and super excited about it. Or I'm still working on this, but I know I'll get there. Like, they're specifically talking about what they're learning and where they're trying to grow and learn themselves. And I think that we just want to keep fostering throughout the grades, all the way up to the high school level, which is exciting to see that they're doing more around standards-based grades. So it's all about student learning. It's all about keeping that love of learning beyond, you know, high school.
I mean, how powerful would it be if Jessica and Dr. Ema's students went to Alicia and Tara's high school? They would come in with all the skills they needed to already jump into those conversations. I do believe that will happen at some point, not necessarily with this group, but with our elementary students going into high school with that language and not having to build their capacity at that point. But you all are truly doing amazing things for students. I know it's the end of a school year, and I just appreciate you being here with our audience today to share what you've learned, taking time from your students to be with us. We're just so appreciative of you all and the amazing things you're doing for your students. So just thank you for being here and for sharing with us and learning with our audience. That does conclude our webinar for today. I know I'm 2 minutes over. I apologize if anyone is here beyond where they planned, but thank you so much for being here. I know our group shared that they're using Otis. If you'd like to learn more about how you can track and communicate student progress towards learning standards with Otis, we are at otis.com. That concludes today. Have a great rest of the school year, everyone, and just thank you for being here with us. We appreciate you all.